So with election day now over, we're going to take a look at some of the deeper processes which we're all captured. I'll be spending most of the next half hour speaking with someone who wrote the article, Revenge of the Technocrats, how Canada's Liberal Party became an appendage of the Great Reset. My guest is Matthew Ehret. He is an editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review and senior fellow at the American University in Moscow. He's author of the Untold History of Canada book series and Clash of the Two Americas. In 2019, he co-founded the Montreal-based Rising Tide Foundation. And he's also a journalist as well. So Matthew, thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be with you, Michael.
So first of all, just talking about the election for a second. So the Trudeau government won again, and it's basically the same result as we had 2 years ago. Just a quick, but before we get into some of the deep history of his party, maybe you could just give us a quick recap of what you saw playing out over the last few weeks.
Oh, yes, most certainly. Well, I think a lot of people were a little bit befuddled. We were only expecting to have an election in 2 years. It happened a lot sooner than people realized. And obviously, the Liberal government of Chrystia Freeland was pushing for a majority. We are about to enter globally, and there's no real way to answer why this happened from a just purely Canadian context. You have to look globally that we are going into a period of storm. We are caught as a transatlantic community between two systems, and the system that began really with the 1971 floating of the fixed exchange rate, the floating of the dollar onto the floating exchange rates, and the abandonment of the gold standard, ushered in an age of deregulation, consumerism, speculation, and increasingly imperialism as nations were looted abroad to service ever-growing rates of debt and consumption in the developed part of the sector. And that became sort of a new type of model that ingrained itself for over 40 years. That is now coming to an end. The bubbles are collapsing. We've got about a $1.2 quadrillion derivatives bubble. And even before COVID-19 was sprung onto us, already people like Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, was already saying that we are heading towards a financial Armageddon. This is months before the Event 201, organized by the World Economic Forum. So we are now entering a fight over what the new system is going to look like. Going into this, those who run and manage the Liberal Party, and soon Mark Carney will be amongst that crowd, both Carney and Freeland being both Oxford, operatives, as well as trustees of the World Economic Forum, are high-level managers, high-level technocrats who have been selected to increasingly manage the ship of state. They wanted a majority government because in Canada, if you have a majority, you can do whatever you want. And there is less need for pesky democratic institutions like opposition or debate. They did not get that. And I think that's the best thing that could be said. And I think also just seeing the support rise for the People's Party of Canada was also useful, although there were no seats won. Now, whether that's the effect of some under-discovered fraud or whatever, I don't know. I've never seen crowds as large as I saw across Canada marching against the vaccine passports, all of whom I would imagine would have voted with the majority for the People's Party of Canada. Why that didn't happen again, I can only imagine. We know that there was
Trudeau himself. You mentioned it as the party of Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody's portraying that this election is because of Trudeau, who's serving himself to get a majority government or something like that. I mean, well, what's your take on Trudeau as an individual? I mean, is he,
that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I wrote an article back in 2012 called "What Does the Empire Have Planned for Poor Justin Trudeau?" He's a ski instructor, drama teacher. I don't see him as much more than a synthetic shell, sort of like a Biden personality type who can only operate with controllers, handlers, and teleprompters, and coaches. People like Gerard Butts, for example, was an early handler who ran the World Wildlife Fund of Canada, who was his childhood friend placed to manage him but his whole life, I mean, has been largely under the watch of people who would like to use him. And in the new article you reference on the technocrats in Canada, I took the opportunity to just go through a little bit of who those handlers were, both in terms of what selected him and put him on a platform in 2006 to see if he was the stuff that they needed to revise and reform the Liberal Party. In a conference that happened in Mont Blanc, run by a bunch of privy councillors like John Manley, Bob Ray, Anne McClellan. Diana Carney herself was a big part of this, the wife of Mark Carney, under a think tank called Canada 2020. But yeah, I don't see Justin as much more than a pretty face who's programmed.
Let's take it back to well over a century. There's you mentioned that a group of individuals are the Fabians. They were active from the beginning. Basically, they're facing two. Basically, there's the influence of the British imperialists, and then there's the influence of the American vision of nationality on in between. So there's kind of a face-off against two, and then into this circle, you see these Fabians are trying to have used the Rhodesian Trust and the Round Table's selection ultimately to influence the direction of the Canadian political parties. Take us through some of that that whole scenario where these are elites who are directing things.
Well, in the most summary fashion, because I know we have a limited amount of time, and people, if they want to really dig into this more, they can go to my website, canadianpatriot.org, to get a fuller picture. And my book series, my 4-volume Untold History of Canada, goes through exactly what you just said. Carol Quigley is a historian from Georgetown University who did remarkable work. When I read his books on the role of the Round Table movement from its foundation in really the 1902 Rhodes Trust with the death of Cecil Rhodes all the way through the 20th century, it was an eye-opener for me, and it completely shifted how I was reading and evaluating Canadian history, because nothing can be understood without these two organizations. One of the key things is the Fabian, like you said, the Fabian Society of Canada. This was originally modeled on the British Fabian Society that was run out of the London School of Economics. It was a very oligarchical organization that utilized socialism to attract labor, but really it was always about like Bernard Shaw, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, Lord Halford Mackinder was a leading figure. They were themselves misanthropic anti-humanists who liked utilizing the veneer of socialism to create a scientific dictatorship, a technocratic management of society under scientific principles, which in their mind was based on eugenics and population control. In Canada, this organization was set up in 1931 called the League for Social Reconstruction, founded by 4 Rhodes Scholars and 1 official Fabian. So this was done to provide a solution to the economic crisis of the 1930s. One of the key figures in Canada who was a runner who controlled the Round Table movement was a student of Lord Milner, was named Vincent Massey, who was our first Canadian-born Governor General. He was at the time the Liberal Party president in 1931-32, while the Conservatives of R.B. Bennett were in power. R.B. Bennett was also an Anglophile who retired to London as a Viscount after his tenure in Canada was finished. But there was a battle, just like there was in 2006, over what the Liberal Party's character would be. And different agents within the Fabian Society and Round Table were trying to, on the one hand, when they realized that the League for Social Reconstruction and its political party, which became the Commonwealth Party of Canada, or later NDP, when that was not achieving the success it needed, they changed and focused on taking over, like a virus takes over a cell, the Liberal Party, to try to purge it of a lot of the pro-development leaders who were then known as Laurier liberals. They were all people who had worked with Sir Wilfrid Laurier, who was a very devout supporter of progress and anti-Malthusian. That is, he was against controlling or reducing world population, and he was a big fan of Abraham Lincoln. So Laurier liberals.
You say that, I mean, yeah, it wasn't always this way. I mean, it had a more progressive era back around in the times of Laurier. And,
Oh yeah.
But I mean, all of these influences, the Malthusians and so on, it's more associated in the public mind. It's more associated with the Nazis, right? And but
Yeah.
it did have a time in the early on where it came out of these British constructs. But yes.
Well, just to say, yeah, I mean, the Nazis modeled their eugenics and sterilization policies on what was already being done in the United States in 33 U.S. states, starting with Indiana in 1907. As well as two Canadian provinces, Alberta and BC, had both sterilized over 7,000 people according to eugenics practices, which, again, Hitler modeled these things on the practices of the West. The science was supported back then, just in many ways like much of the science is funded today, by foundations like the Macy Foundation, the Josiah Macy Foundation being a big one, also Rockefeller Foundation and Carnegie Foundation, which were also, by the way, funding the arts and historical narratives of Canada, which was one of the interesting ironies, is that many of the historians like W.L. Morton, who's a famous Canadian historian, was also funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, while at the same time was himself a Rhodes Scholar, promoting anti-American narratives, always painting America as intrinsically this evil empire, but yet he was being funded by American institutions. So why? What was that really about? And same thing for Granstein, was also a CIA, which is the Canadian branch of the Roundtable movement, kind of like the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, is the American branch of the Roundtable movement. He was also an operative for this group, promoting anti-American historical narratives. So why? And to answer why, you got to understand that what took Laurier out of power in 1911 was when Laurier was trying to organize a Zollverein, what was called the Customs Union. That's what Bismarck did to unify Germany around a protective tariff. And Laurier was utilizing the American system model as applied by Abraham Lincoln. Now, most American presidents, the ones who tend not to die in office, are typically idiots or traitors. There's been very few really genuine American presidents who died for the cause of the American Constitution, but Lincoln was one of them. So is Garfield, and so is McKinley. Now, Laurier, who he wanted to create a pro-development complex that could ban British dumping of cheap goods around big projects, big infrastructure projects, like the Transcontinental Railway and other things that had been built by Canada and the US. He foresaw a doubling of the population of Canada as well, up to 60 million, he said, which was actually in his time probably quadrupling. But so his allies, when he was ousted, it was, and I write about this, a roundtable movement as well as Orangemen. It's a Freemasonic movement based in primarily Ontario, which ran an operation to oust him in a coup in 1911 that destroyed his program. This program, by the way, is nothing like NAFTA. But he said to his biographer, O.D. Skelton, who became one of the Laurier liberals who was blocking the Roundtable movement from taking over Canadian foreign policy, Canada is now governed by a junta sitting in London known as the Roundtable. This is 1916, he's saying this, with ramifications in Toronto, in Winnipeg, in Victoria, with Tories and Grits, that's liberals and conservatives, receiving their ideas from London and insidiously forcing them onto their respective parties. Laurier's party ended up taking back control in the 1920s and then again in the 1930s. O.D. Skelton, Adam Short, Chubby Power, there were a few others too, the Justice Minister. Most of them died in 1940 at a certain point strategically, and when they died, the foreign policy establishment of Canada was totally taken over by these roundtable operatives who, under Vincent Massey, were also beginning to infest the Liberal Party on every level. And their coup finally happened in an official way. Like, they fully consolidated their power when C.D. Howe died, Clarence Decatur Howe, who was sort of the minister of everything and led a lot of the biggest projects of growth, the Avro Arrow, Canada's being the second country to have nuclear civilian power. All of the big projects were spearheaded by C.D. Howe. So when he died in 1957 and the Liberals lost power, that 5-year interim under Diefenbaker, when the Liberals were out of power, was when you had a think tank that was run by these roundtable movements that purged the liberals of anybody reminiscent of this old wisdom.
Well,
And
that's
they brought,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah, it's not like, well, I don't know. When you talk about purging of it, I mean, it's not like they necessarily, infected them like the Borg or something like that. I mean, they just
no.
ended up on the outskirts of everything. And all of that happened during the Diefenbaker era, you say.
Yeah, it was called, many of them who were purged referred to it as a palace coup, a palace revolution. Um, the the form it took, you're right, it wasn't exactly like a Borg, but kind of was, because they wanted it. They always wanted technocratic management, and I do think of these like cold, Great Reset type of personalities as kind of Borg-like. They do think of artificial intelligence, the merging of human beings and machines, as being the inevitable course of human destiny that they have to lead. And when you listen to people like Yuval Harari, the one of the ideologues who's always trotted out at these World Economic Forum summits, he talks about how Darwinism has been the driving force of human destiny, which has no purpose, no directionality, no morality. Which he's insulted by the idea of morality, but he says now in the fourth industrial revolution, or the third wave, that humankind will finally take our evolutionary destiny into our own hands, and the intelligent designers, he says, of this new age is going to be people who run Facebook and Google. So they are Borg-like in that sense. They don't believe in soul. They don't believe in justice or metaphysical principles that have any intrinsic value. They deny that because they use computers and binary computer modeling as their model for what the human mind and soul is and how society should be thus governed. That's no different today than it was when Vincent Massey was talking about the need to create a new technocratic government of Canada, or these Fabian Society of Canada operatives talking about the same thing for a scientifically managed society. They are Borg-like. Now, the thing is, no, you're right. It took the form of conferences. So they organized these think tank conferences in 1960, modeled on what Vincent Massey had done with the Port Hope Conference of 1932, to try to bring together, it's again, mostly people like Walter Gordon, Maurice Lamontagne, who both became presidents of the Privy Council office. Lester Pearson was a tool. He was an Oxford Massey scholar. Keith Davey, Tom Kent. They were all brought together with many others to formulate a repackaging of what the Liberal Party would be. So that was the process of the purging and also the creation of a new technocratically managed type of party under a new image. They basically, when they came back to power, they created a new flag to try to give off the illusion that we were more independent and had shook off the yoke of British controls earlier, right? That was 1963. A new song was given. And it was basically like Beatlemania, which this is what they did when they repackaged. They found that Lester B. Pearson wasn't doing so good of a job selling himself, especially to the French Canadian population, because he couldn't speak French. And they realized that he was not very effective as a thinker. And so they had to do kind of like what they're doing to Justin Trudeau. They're preparing the groundwork to get in somebody a bit more competent to manage the ship, who at that time was an NDP leader, or a person who had named Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Pierre Elliott Trudeau with Pelletier and his three doves were all NDP. They were working from the Privy Council office to purge Quebec originally from Christianity in the 1950s, running Cité Libre, which was sort of a news magazine, kind of like what Trotsky's magazines did in Russia earlier, to organize young intellectuals who were very nihilistic, existential, around a hate for all. And Quebec had a lot of corruption, right? There was a lot of corruption in the church, no doubt. No, I'm not trying to say it's all good, but it wasn't all bad either. There was a big resistance against eugenics from the Catholic Church because they had a sense that this is wrong. You can't do that. Or the Darwinian reforms in education that were being pushed through were being resisted by the church. So anyway, there was also a lot of infrastructure building, and that was under the l'Union Nationale government. That was all purged, and Pierre Elliott Trudeau was brought in.
About how they set up the system so that you would deliberately attract these people who are not your average Joe, and would be at the same time hostile to those Catholics or other individuals that who
it was basically the replacement of one oligarchy for another oligarchy. They got rid of the English the Vatican influenced oligarchs of Quebec, and they replaced it with a more like people like the Desmarais clan. Maurice Strong was originally one of the people who was on the selection committee that did the talent search for Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Was like, okay, well, let's use him in 1964. He was also the vice president of Power Corporation. So they created basically a new indigenous Quebec, and I don't say indigenous from the native sense. I just mean it from the standpoint of French Canadian technocratic oligarchy. A lot of this was run by Vincent Massey's collaborator, Father Georges Henri Lévesque, who ran the sociology department at Université de Laval. This Pierre Elliott Trudeau and many of these Rhodes scholars worked out of there to manage the Quiet Revolution, which was just a technocratic revolution. And this is what later went on to crushing the L'Union Nationale when it tried to do a revival under Daniel Johnson Sr. in 1966-67. And it also, I think, there was a fight over what the future of Quebec was going to be at that time. And both Pierre Elliott Trudeau as well as René Lévesque hated Daniel Johnson because he broke the Hegelian polar game where it was supposed to be, Lévesque and Pierre Elliott Trudeau worked together on Cité Libre. They both collaborated on this. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was the editor-in-chief. René Lévesque was a frequent contributor or writer. Both of them were creating, again, a dialectic of just Quebec language-based fights against the federal government that would be like the Lincoln that would fight to keep the nation together. And it was a fake. It was a game, a theater of the absurd. But Daniel Johnson Sr., you see, was breaking that with his big fight for Manicouagan 5 to create a new engineering civilization in Quebec with Charles de Gaulle, who he invited to come to organize with him for a global international front. It was called a global front against empire and progress around the Monde Francophonie, which ultimately was disrupted when Daniel Johnson died in 1968 at the day that he was inaugurating the Manicouagan 5. Never an autopsy done. And then just a few months later, Charles de Gaulle was ousted under a bit of a color revolution in France.
Could you talk about some of the, with this new guard in charge, can you talk about some of the efforts put place by Trudeau Sr. that helped sculpt the path towards the current generation?
Sure. Between and I guess we only have a few minutes left here, right?
Yeah.
All right. So between 1968 and 72 was the Technocratic Revolution. Trudeau gave a speech saying that cybernetics and systems analysis, which were developed by Norbert Wiener after World War II, also funded by the Macy Foundation, and these were the tools that would have to be used to save society. This is what organized the complete overhaul of the federal government. And it was turned into a giant complex bureaucracy under Trudeau, highly compartmentalized. And that's the way cybernetics works. The idea is a helmsman. So you have a gubernatoritos, it's a Greek word. And the idea is in a boat, only the helmsman needs to know what the hull is doing. Everybody else needs to just have specialization in their local part. Rowers, whatever, everybody else. Engineers on the machines below, they don't need to think of the whole. So the idea was to organize an entire government around having only a small few within the Privy Council office and Prime Minister's office together, overlapping, who managed and saw the whole. Everybody else was highly bureaucratized and could only see myopically within their specialized departments. And so this is what was put into place. It demoralized a lot of civil servants. Books were written about this. It destroyed the momentum for any type of big development projects, which required a 10, 20-year orientation that had formerly governed Canada's foreign policy and internal policy thinking, because all of a sudden, everything could be mathematized and controlled by those who want to just maintain a system rather than change the system. These guys are about control. See, that's the Borg-like thing. They're all about controlling the thing. And when you have large-scale infrastructure or scientific and technological progress that discovers new resources and new laws of the universe that applies them to new technologies, all of the rules that manage the production and consumption and motion of goods in the system changes. You change the rules of the game. They don't want the great game's rules to be changed. So that's what these control freaks have always been about. And moving through the 1970s, this has sort of been what has grown Canada's deep state, as well as the US deep state too. And I would just say one thing, because people are like, well, that was maybe 1968 to 72. Certainly the Milton Friedman free trade years of everything goes that reigned for 40 years, that doesn't apply to that. Yes and no. See, the thing is, what they did is, on a governmental level, they kept those types of institutions, the cybernetics institutions, whereas on the economic level, they did a nation stripping by saying, okay, you want freedom, you want personal enterprise, let's give you so much freedom, it's going to make you sick. You'll never want freedom again. And they deregulated everything in a certain type of way that created an overbloated consumerism that was ultimately self-destructive, as we now see the effects of no infrastructure investments for 40 years, like a complete loss of our manufacturing, a dumbed down population, right? A decadence that's beyond belief. It's absurd. Where people are now saying, oh yeah, like young people, the millennials, they're like, well, yeah, we've had enough capitalism. I think we need now something that transcends that, and so they're falling for things like the you'll own nothing and be happy. Owning things is the cause of corruption. Yeah, exactly. But they always, and so now they're integrating now the economic and political aspects of things under the Great Reset, under a new type of managerial system, or what James Burnham and my wife wrote a paper on this called the oligarchical collectivism, attacked by Orwell. But that's really what they want. Now, there are nations in the world that are rejecting that are saying no to the depopulation, no to the anti-development, no to one world government. But those countries are primarily in Eurasia, around the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Belt and Road Initiative. It's not here in the West under the transatlantic cage, I should say.
Yeah. So basically this, I mean, it's probably the most fundamental changes that have been taken place by any political party in a long time. I'm wondering if I mean, and it doesn't seem like any of the opposition parties are fighting it, really. So I'm wondering what would you suggest we could do? I mean, organize a new political party, or should we take some sort of action with our economic tools, or individually? What do you think we could do to reverse the tide of this direction that we're on?
Well, people might not find my answer very satisfying. I think that the closest thing to a viable type of party we have as a movement is probably at this time, with all of its problems, the People's Party of Canada of Maxime Bernier, with all of its problems. And I'm not a fan of Maxime Bernier. However, I would say as far as like a viable thing that's recognizing the evil of the Great Reset, or the vaccination dictatorship, all this stuff, it's the only thing, unfortunately, at the moment. Now, setting up a new party, maybe, but the problem is primarily, I think, number one, it's cultural. You have to get people who have a better sense of the dynamics of what they are operating within. Most people who try to make a change in Canada, they jump right into the thing without having taken the time to really map out their history, map out the control centers, like the real control centers of Canada. So they end up getting sabotaged, undermined left and right. It doesn't work out very well. And also they tend to think too Canadian centric. A lot of Canadians have the same problem as many Americans. They think of their problems as well as their solutions as located within the boundaries of their own country. That is not the case. Our problems are not located within Canada. It's a global issue. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's an economic collapse that's a global collapse. It's managed by a global oligarchy that's transnational. They want to create a one world government to get rid of all nation states everywhere forever. And the only opposition to that are the Eurasian powers that are all saying no to getting rid of nation states as the foundation of international law, and they're saying no to depopulation. So you have to work with the policies of those who are resisting in a serious way this oligarchy, Russia, China, other countries of that. Increasingly, Iran is integrating into that. So is Pakistan. So are many other countries of Eurasia. We are very, very stuck in our own little worlds right now. And to the degree that we do that, I don't think we can create a battle plan that has any success in the long term. We will be undermined. So that's part of it. I don't have a straight, strong, solid answer for people, though, as far as like clear cut. Here's what you do.
Yeah, well, that's certainly clear. And I got to tell you, Matthew, this is probably unlike most of the post-election rundowns that will be taking place in other media. But it's welcome on the Global Research News Hour. Thank you so much for being my guest this half hour.
Thanks for having me on.
I've been speaking with Matthew Ehret, the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review.